Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you all hanging in there on a marathon day. As it was said earlier, I'm from Ireland, which was an Arctic country about 10,000 years ago. And we're getting ready to apply to the Arctic Council for the next 10,000 years. We expect to be an Arctic country again. But in the interim, I'm going to talk today about the impacts and the responses of a particular group of organisms, migratory species, which tend to be quite numerous in polar regions. So, there we go. So we've heard a lot about changes in the cryosphere today, and a little about impacts on the biosphere, and I'm going to focus a lot on that. Some of this has already been covered, so I won't deal with this slide in too much detail, other than we expect the rate of change also in the biological realm to be unprecedented. For a lot of species in various parts of the world, in temperate and mid-latitude regions, there are options when your climate changes. You can move north or south, you can adapt, or unfortunately, you may be one of the losers, you die out. But in polar species, we know that the first option really isn't an option at all. So these individuals, these species, have to essentially acclimatize, adapt, ride out the change that they're facing, or the consequences. The alternative is obviously quite extreme. So we're particularly interested in our research at looking at how individuals have the ability to acclimatize. We all have an ability to deal with, for example, the weather we're dealing with right now. We put on clothes, things like that. Or populations to adapt. And the concern we have is the idea of adaptation has been handed down to us as something that's very slow. But we're obviously intrigued with the idea of populations actually being able to adapt very, very quickly. A good example would be obviously various outbreaks of flu or what have you. We can see how biological systems can essentially adapt in one generation. And then how species can evolve to deal with those changes. So here's a few little sort of examples of the differences that maybe polar species and species at lower latitude space. So in the case of Arctic species, it's obviously they're facing a northward contraction of their range. Very often we're seeing with marine species, there's going to be increased connectivity among these high Arctic populations and increased isolation of subarctic populations in areas like the Gulf of Alaska, the Okhotsk Sea, and the Baltic Sea. And obviously a major shift in their migratory behavior. I'll give you a few examples of that. With temperate species, it's typically predicted and even seen that they're going to experience a range expansion. But because we still have seasonal sea ice, it's not just a simple replacement or displacement. It's going to involve increased overlap between temperate and polar species, with some interesting consequences for behavior, ecology, and evolution. Here's a nice summary of a study that's been done by a number of scientists working with native groups across the Arctic on the bowhead whale. This is research done in Greenland, in Canada, in the Arctic, or in Alaska. And the bowhead migrates north into Arctic waters, and you have here on the left some tracks from bowheads in the eastern Arctic recently. And here's some tracks from bowheads in the western Arctic, and they have been isolated by this multi-year ice that we're used to in the central Arctic. But more recently, we're starting to see those populations now actually connect, interact with who knows what consequences. Another example is, for example, some fish species that are now dealing with new invasive species in terms of competition. The polar cod has been a very important sort of key species to the Arctic environment. It's now dealing with a lot of temperate species moving north. We heard earlier about how, for example, walrus are dealing with various changes in their access to food. A consequence of these fish changes, for example, here is a study of seabirds. The black guillemot George Devokie has been studying for over 40 years. And this species essentially lost access to the polar cod because the cod went out with the ice, and the distance was too far for the animals to efficiently feed. So what they employed was an alternative strategy. We're seeing animals essentially acclimatize in their lifetime to a different strategy to try and survive. Another unexpected consequence for these poor birds was an increase in a very unexpected predator because of the loss of sea ice. We had more polar bears on land, and this resulted in a decline in chick survival. George came up with a very novel solution here where he used camera cases as essentially nest boxes, and these birds took to these pretty quickly. Another thing that could take up an entire talk is the risk of infectious disease, where migratory species may play a key role either in the emergence of some of these diseases or indeed in some cases in the elimination of some of those diseases. So sort of pathogen dynamics is an area that requires further study in the Arctic. And we're starting to look at the actual genetics and epigenetics behind adaptation and survival. You know, what do we have? Do we have the right stuff to deal with some of these consequences? But we're going to have to deal with it very quickly. It's not a gradual process. And so there's some very interesting work to be done in that area that I can't go into. But beyond the species, so what are the implications at the ecosystem level? Well, we know that productivity is going to change. Probably we've heard about the permafrost thawing, you know, the increase in nutrients or the shifting of nutrient loading. That's going to affect migratory behavior. We know in some cases fish that were artificially fed excess food stopped migrating. So we're probably going to see shifts in migratory behavior based on changes in nutrients. Another key role of migratory species is they're the ones who connect ecosystems, right? So they're the ones who connect subarctic with Arctic, temperate with subarctic systems. So we're predicting to see changes in those areas. Here's a very interesting study where scientists looked at the impact of a new predator. In this case, it was Arctic fox on the Aleutian Islands. And they found that infested islands, as they were fox-infested islands, wiped out nesting bird communities. But there was this long-term effect on the vegetation. And they figured, well, why is that? Well, the birds were transporting nutrients and minerals from the marine environment to the terrestrial environment. So here we have migratory species essentially linking environments, and the depletion of those birds can change the entire sort of complexion of these Aleutian Islands. So I think we should expect more of that. Here, well, basically I can kind of go to the next step where we've heard a lot about hybridization among polar species as something we may expect a lot more of, where different species come into contact. You know, is this a good or a bad thing? I can't say, but it's probably an adaptive response. Polar bears and brown bears are adapting to their environment. We need to give them time and space to try and adapt to the cards that we've dealt them. So we have new bears on the block. This is a growler or a pizzly on the right. So, you know, again, is this adaptation or is this something that we feel is in some way detrimental? Another way where migratory species are obviously going to affect the broader ecosystem are the roles they play in these trophic cascades. We talked about these foxes being artificially introduced into islands, but we're seeing lots of new predators, for example, moving from temperate zones into the Arctic. They're already going to have these sort of cascading effects. Everybody here probably knows the classic study of killer whales having this major impact on the ecosystem in nearshore areas of the North Pacific, because killer whales started to prey on sea otters. Sea otters were keystone species that grazed on sea urchins, which kept predation on the kelp beds low. So when the killer whales came in, it shifted the whole balance. We're starting to see more and more killer whales in the Arctic. Traditional knowledge is actually telling us that they're primarily feeding on mammals. So what's going to be the impact of that? If they're going to be feeding on seals and beluga whales, what are the cascading effects that we're going to see from these new predators? And finally, sort of switching to the societal impacts, obviously we're apex predators too, so we fit into that cascading sort of trophic web model, increasingly people starting to look at our connection to ecosystems in terms of what they call ecosystem services, which is a human-biased approach. What can the ecosystem do for me in terms of productivity or in terms of support? And there's various ways of categorizing ecosystem services. So if we use that context, we can start to organize our ideas about how migratory species may influence ecosystem services. We know they are a major cultural and subsistence resource to indigenous peoples. That's probably going to change. We know that the emergence of new species as potentially commercially important, that's an ecosystem service that's going to change. The roles of disease, what are going to be the impacts of emerging diseases and pathogen movement? So I just would sort of encourage you maybe to start looking at things in that context, because we know people are trying to put some kind of economic estimate to that. But these are obviously very difficult to predict. And finally, I was glad to hear a few people mention the word resilience. And I think this itself may be a very useful way for probably everybody in the room to get their head around how Arctic and even subarctic and temperate systems are going to deal with these physical changes. Essentially, can they take a licking and keep on ticking? What are the boundaries of these self-organizing systems' ability to deal with these changes? And I think the Arctic Council has certainly taken the lead on that. And the Arctic Resilience Report I found very useful. And for scientists like me, I'm kind of taking the resilience concept and looking at it more narrowly in terms of which species in the system, are there keystone species, can essentially deal with these changes we're handing them, so that they can help maintain the essential character of much bigger systems. Who are the species that essentially can deal with the rapid change? So with that, I think I kept on time. So thank you very much.